Picross is a game where you have a grid and you want to figure out which tiles you want to color in and which ones to leave out, based on the numbers outside the grid. This 3 next to the row indicates that there are 3 adjacent tiles in that row that are colored in, and the ones say that there's one tile that is colored in their column. If there are multiple numbers next to a row or a column like these ones, then that means that there's a gap between the colored tiles, and that gap could be of any size. And that's all of the rules. It's a really simple and a surprisingly fun game, and so I wanted to make one for a long time. I made it once in computer craft 3 years ago, but that was obviously very limited, so I decided to make a fully fledged browser game out of it that you can play on the GitHub link in the description or simply just by going to this link. In it, you can choose from a few sets of randomized levels that get harder the further you go in them. There are some easy ones, but I also try to put in some really hard ones. Those are randomized beforehand, but there are a few thousand of them, so running out of them shouldn't be a problem. And also, to solve these harder boards, I made some power-ups that change the colors of the numbers for you to know which ones you can advance in. And to get the power-ups, you need points that you get when completing a set of levels, so you're incentivized to play the easier ones first. Let me show you how the power-ups work. The yellow and orange one means that you can fully complete the line that the number is next to, and the blue one means that you can do something in that line but you can't complete it yet. Sometimes that is just putting an X on a tile that for sure cannot be colored in, and white just means that the line is already complete, so you should put the X's on the empty tiles. There is an extra trick that you have to use to complete some of the boards, especially the harder ones, and that is to color in the tiles in the middle that for sure have to be colored in, even without knowing the whole line. For example, looking at this tree, we know that it can only be either here or here, and that means that the middle two tiles have to be colored in. You can use this same logic even when there are multiple numbers next to a line. For example, in this 1-2 line, the fourth tile has to be colored in. An easy way to spot these is to just start at an edge and see how many tiles are left after you draw every number with a gap in between them. Let me show you some examples. So doing this 5-2-1 line, you just draw all of them out and there's a 2 block gap at the end, so you remove 2 from each of them, and then you're left with a 3. And doing this 4-1-2-4 line, you're left with only one tile, so you only have to remove 1 from each of them. If you think about it a little bit, then you can figure out how that works, but knowing this is very necessary in order to complete the hardest boards. And speaking of, how hard are these very hard boards exactly, and how did I generate them? Well, the problem with randomly generated boards is that you might not be able to solve them. So I had to write a code that could solve a Picross board the same way a human would. And then the same code can just count how many steps it took to solve any given board. Then I just made it so it generates a lot of completely random boards and saves the amount of steps each of them took to solve. And after 1 or 2 hours, it found a board that takes about 43 steps to solve. Here's a time lapse of me solving it with the power-ups. I think this is a very beautiful board. A lot of times there are only 1 or 2 lines that you can advance in, and that makes you really appreciate the fact that this is even solvable, and the fact that this board was found by creating thousands of completely random boards, and this one just happened to be the most difficult of them all. And at this point, I've already made an editor for the game because I wanted to have some levels that actually make up a picture once you solve them. And I thought I could load in this really hard board and see if I could make it even harder somehow. So I loaded it in, and pressing space shows how many steps it takes to solve it in the top left corner. And so I randomly removed the tile and saw that that made the board only take 39 steps to solve. So I undid that and removed the tile next to it, and that board takes 47 steps to solve. At this point, I realized that I could make the boards way more difficult by changing their tiles one at a time. So I wrote a code that changes the tile that would make the hardest board, and then it repeats that for however long I hold down the button. And with that, I ended up with this board, which takes a wild 88 steps to solve. Now, if you thought the previous one was impressive, this one is genuinely a miracle that it's even possible. You spend a lot of time figuring out the only tile you can change, just so that there's going to be another only tile that you can change after it. And with this, you really have to think as to how the connected tiles could exist in certain places. And after that, I was wondering just how much harder you can make a board with this method. So I picked a random board that originally only took 3 steps to solve, and ran the tile changer code with it. And to no one's surprise, the board resulting from that only takes 93 steps to solve. I later ran this again a few times and also tried it with other easy boards, but it never got above 90, so this was extremely lucky. But I still had hope that I could find a board that's even harder. So I ran the same random board generator code for a few hours, but this time it also tries to change every random board to be the hardest it can be. And with that, I found the board from the thumbnail that takes 100 steps to solve. This one starts out with a row that's fully completable, and then for a while you have a surprising amount of choices you can make as to which lines to focus on. But then a bit later you go back to the old, you can only advance in one tile in the whole board and without it would be unsolvable stick. And just before fully solving it, you're left with an empty square in the corner, which is probably why it takes 100 steps to solve. And this is the hardest board I could find so far. Some of you watching who like to engage in mathematics might realize that this process where you take one step to reach a higher number until the only step you can take would make the number decrease, would make the highest number you reach the local maxima. For the people who are not familiar with that, it might help to use an example of trying to reach the top of a mountain in an incredibly dense fog. You can see where you're standing and which ways you can go to reach a higher elevation, so you just pick one and eventually you reach a point where anywhere you could go would be downwards. But you don't know if that's the very top of the mountain or not, and you don't know where you could go to get even higher. Just like I don't know how to find a board that would take over 100 steps to solve. Wouldn't it be easier if I could just know how hard every single possible board is? But if I'd like to know that for every 15 by 15 board, then I would need to go through a good few 53 unvirgintillion boards. And a good rule of thumb is that if you need to look up how many digits a number has, then it might be a bit too big. So I scaled back and checked every 5 by 5 board, which is only 33.5 million boards, which took less than an hour because 5 by 5 boards are really easy for a computer to solve. And I found that this one is the hardest 5 by 5 board, and it takes 16 steps to solve. And of course, a late rotated and mirrored version of this would still take 16 steps to solve. Although how I keep track of steps might not be perfect, since for some of them it says 14 steps. So it's a little bit of a Parker algorithm, but I think that's because it prefers to start with a specific axis. So the steps might be off by 1 or 2, but generally a bigger number means that it's harder. And actually I started to really like this symbol. The 4x4 boards didn't have any particularly hard configurations, so this is the smallest, hardest square board shape that is possible in Picross. So if an alien civilization would one day come up with the idea of Picross, then they too would find this shape. And I've actually been thinking about rebranding this channel, so this shape is now my new profile picture. And actually me scaling back from the 15 by 15 boards to the 5 by 5 ones ties into the next thing I'd like to talk about really well, which is that I had to scale back the scope of this Picross game in general. People don't talk about this enough, but by far the hardest part about doing something creative, especially making a game, is to accept that you're going to have about 10 times the amount of ideas that you could realistically do before it gets too much to handle, and you would just end up going on to the next project before finishing your current one. Unless you specifically try to make the project as small as possible while still being relatively happy with it. So could this game have more variety, more game modes, a better editor, more handmade levels, more rewards for completing levels, better visuals, or just a whole other game in it? Of course it could, but then I wouldn't finish it and you would never be able to play it. And that's way worse than the game being slightly lacking in content. So yeah, I guess I could talk more about those handmade boards. I made 50 of them that each represent an image, which took a while but it was pretty relaxing. I didn't really have to think about what I was doing or why. And I think it's a nice thing to do these kind of monotone things once in a while. It's a nice break from the big creative projects. Sometimes feel like a centimeter per second squared. I hope you like playing my game. I know I just said that it's really important to scale back the scope of the game, but it doesn't mean that I won't come back to develop it further. I'm planning to make multiple videos per project, so if everything goes well, you'll be able to see more Picross content on this channel. I hope you're having a nice day, and feel free to share what you thought about this game or the video, and I'll see you next time. So I loaded it in and pressing space shows how many steps it takes to solve it in the top left corner. Pressing space shows how many steps it takes to solve it.